The person who does not permit their spirit to be beaten down and upset by dryness and helplessness, but who lets God lead them peacefully through the wilderness and desires no other support or guidance than that of pure faith and trust in God alone, will be brought to the promised land. They will taste the peace and joy of union. They will, without seeing, have a habitual, comforting, obscure, and mysterious awareness of their God, present and acting in all the events of life. The person who is not afraid to abandon all their spiritual progress into the hands of God, to put prayer, virtue, merit, grace, and all gifts in the keeping of that from whom they all must come, will quickly be led to peace in union with that. Their peace will be all the sweeter because it will be free of every care. Just as the light of faith is darkness to the mind, so the supreme natural activity of the mind and will in contemplation and infused love at first seems to us like inaction. That is why our natural faculties are anxious and restless. That is why they refuse to keep still. They want to be the sole principals of their own acts. The thought that they cannot act according to their own spontaneous impulsion brings them a suffering and humiliation which they find it hard to stand. But contemplation lifts us beyond the sphere of our natural powers. When you were travelling in a plane close to the ground, you realize that you are going somewhere. But in the stratosphere, although you may be going 7 times as fast, you lose all sense of speed. As soon as there is any reasonable indication that God is drawing the spirit into this way of contemplation, we ought to remain at peace in a prayer that is utterly simplified, stripped of acts and reflections, and clean of images, waiting in emptiness and vigilant expectancy for the will of God to be done in us. This waiting should be without anxiety and without deliberate hunger for any experience that comes within the range of our knowledge or memory. Because any experience that we can grasp or understand will be inadequate and unworthy of the state to which God wishes to bring our souls. The most important practical question that people will ask at this point is, what are the signs that it is safe to abandon formal meditation and rest in this more or less passive expectancy? In the first place, if meditation and effective prayer are easy, spontaneous, and fruitful, they should not be given up. But when they have become practically impossible, or if they simply deaden and exhaust the mind and will, and fill them with disgust, or if they involve them in many distractions, it would be harmful to force your mind to have precise thoughts and your will to go through a routine of specified acts. When the imagination, though it may remain quite active, gives you no more pleasure and no more fruit, but only tires and upsets you, even when it rests on the most attractive of natural or even spiritual things, it is a sign that perhaps you should give up active meditation. If at the same time you find positive peace and derive fruit from resting in a simple and faithful expectation of help from God, it would be better to do that than to persecute your mind and will in a vain effort to beat a few thoughts and affections out of them. For if you reflect on your state, you will easily see that your mind is absorbed in one vast, obscure thought of God, and your will is occupied, if not haunted, with a blind, groping, half-defined desire of God. These two combine to produce in you the anxiety and darkness and helplessness which make lucid and particular acts at once so hard and so futile. And if you allow yourself to remain in silence and emptiness, you may find that this thirst, this hunger that seeks God in blindness and darkness, will grow on you, and at the same time, although you do not yet seem to find anything tangible, peace will establish itself in your soul. On the other hand, if giving up meditation simply means that your mind goes dead and your will gets petrified, and you lean against the wall and spend your half hour of meditation wondering what you are going to get for supper, you had better keep yourself occupied with something definite. After all, there is always a possibility that laziness will dress itself up as prayer of quiet or prayer of simplicity and degenerate into torpor and sleep. The mere absence of activity does not ipso facto turn you into a contemplative. This is where a book may sometimes help you. It is quite normal to use a spiritual book of some kind to get started, even in the kind of prayer where you do not do much actual thinking. When you find some paragraph or sentence that interests you, stop reading and turn it over in your mind and absorb it and contemplate it and rest in the general, serene, effortless consideration of the thought. Not in its details, but as a whole, as something held and savoured in its entirety. And so pass from this to rest in the quiet expectancy of God. If you find yourself getting distracted, go back to the book, to the same sentence, or to another. You can start your mental prayer in this way, not only by using a book, but also by looking at a picture or a symbol, or best of all, in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. But also out in the woods and under the trees. The sweep and serenity of a landscape, fields and hills, are enough to keep a contemplative riding the quiet interior tide of their peace for hours at a time. The absence of activity in contemplative prayer is only apparent. Below the surface, the mind and will are drawn into the orbit of an activity that is deep and intense and supernatural, and which overflows into our whole being and brings forth incalculable fruits. There is no such thing as a kind of prayer in which you do absolutely nothing. If you are doing nothing, you are not praying. On the other hand, if God is the source of your interior activity, the work of your faculties may be entirely beyond conscious estimation, and its results may not be seen or understood. Contemplative prayer is a deep and simplified spiritual activity in which the mind and will rest in a unified and simple concentration upon God, turned to that, intent upon that, and absorbed in its own light. With a simple gaze, which is perfect adoration, because it silently tells God that we have left everything else and desire even to leave our own selves for its sake, and that God alone is important to us. That alone is our desire and our life, and nothing else can give us any joy. What you most need in this dark journey is an unfaltering trust in the divine guidance, as well as the courage to risk everything for that. In many ways, the journey seems to be a foolish gamble, and you may well make many mistakes. You are thoroughly capable of deceiving yourself. Humility and docile submission to the guidance of a good director will neutralize the effect of your own mistakes. Even your director or teacher may not always be right, but you must trust in God, who writes straight on crooked lines and brings great good out of evil. What matters in the contemplative life is not for you or your teacher to be always infallibly right, but for you to be heroically faithful to grace and to love. If God calls you, then God implicitly promises you all the graces you need to reach it. You must be blindly faithful to this promise.